In our first content day, we saw Jesus in action on the Sabbath. On the Lord's Day, he thoroughly ticked off the religious leaders. But why did he do that again? Well, the religious leaders had made many rules that the Jews had to follow on the Sabbath, and Jesus did not follow them. Instead, Jesus asked a lame man a very simple question: do you want to be healed? And this man chose to listen to Jesus. At the command of Jesus, he picked up his bed, and after 38 years, this man walked again. The religious leaders, they were not so impressed. They did not want to be healed from their anger or their unbelief, and so they continued on a path that would eventually lead to murdering Jesus. Now, today's story happens around another feast, not the weekly feast of Sabbath, but instead the feast of the Passover. Now, we're going to learn much more about what the Feast of Passover was, but for now, all you need to know is that Passover celebrates when the Israelites were led out of Egypt by God. Let's quickly recap that story with our friends at What in the Bible.
To protect their own sons from the final plague, God told the Israelites to sacrifice a spotless lamb, a lamb without flaw, and put the blood on the doorposts of their homes. The angel that brought death to the Egyptian sons saw the blood on the doorposts and passed over the Israelite homes. Jewish people celebrate this miraculous part of God's rescue plan each year with a festival called Passover.
Wait a minute. What was so special about that lamb that it could save the life of a boy?
There was nothing special about the lamb. It was just a regular lamb. But God used a spotless lamb as a lesson about sin and a sign of something that would happen much later in his rescue plan.
Now, the lamb was obviously the most important part of the Passover feast. And again, we'll chat more about this in the week to come, but aside from the lamb, bread was super important for this week-long celebration. But it wasn't normal bread. No, God had commanded that they were not allowed to have any leaven, the basic ingredient of normal bread. This would turn all of their bread into thin crackers, known to the Jewish people to this day as matzah. Now, Jesus was going to show us today that he represents something more special than the most special Jewish feast, but there's more than that. Just like Passover was made special by the matzah bread, Jesus' mission, his goal, was going to be made special by something that he is going to call living bread. So first, Jesus is going to prove to us, to the crowds, that he is God. Just like God provided manna in the wilderness for the Jews, Jesus provides food for the 5,000 families that gathered to hear him speak. He shocks his disciples in providing bread and even fish for all of those people in the wilderness of Galilee. Now, the crowds, they ate this miracle up. They were in awe of who Jesus was. He had miraculously turned a stretch of desert into an endless bread drive-thru. But in John chapter 6, verse 25, we see that the crowds that are following Jesus had some of the wrong reasons for following him after that miracle. Jesus says that they came and ate their fill of the loaves of bread. And just like the Israelites in the wilderness, they did not simply want a relationship with God. They wanted more. They wanted their bellies filled. That was their number one priority. But Jesus offers so much more than a simple takeout meal. In John chapter 6, verse 35, he famously says, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger. Whoever believes in me shall never thirst again." The crowds are not at all impressed. They don't want ideas about living bread. They want a loaf of bread right now. We don't blame them, right? During the Passover, they couldn't eat normal bread, and making the matzah was hard work. Jesus providing that bread for them was a welcomed break. But the bread described by Jesus in this conversation is a word picture, just like the bread that was given at the feeding of the 5,000. And not only that, the manna that came down thousands of years earlier in the time of Moses pointed to something as well. Jesus explains to his followers in verse 50 that he is the bread of life who came down from heaven so that one may eat of it and never die. And then he says, "I am the living bread that came down from heaven." The The word picture of living bread that was taught by Jesus during Passover teaches us the following. Jesus provides for us by giving us himself. Where other teachers tell us how to solve our problems, Jesus is the solution himself. Unlike the Pharisees who handed out rules, Jesus gives his own life, just like he gave the bread. He would give of himself on the cross as he will die for everyone that sinned. To believe in what Jesus says is to eat from his bread. The Passover was made special by this matzah bread. It was the kind of bread Jesus most likely gave the 5,000 in the wilderness, just like God provided manna for the Israelites thousands of years earlier. These pictures teach us that Jesus' mission was going to be made special by his own sacrifice just a few months later. Now, the crowds that followed Jesus did not respond with gratitude, but I pray that you and I, standing on this side of the cross and seeing what Jesus has done for us, that we would respond with gratitude, not only for the benefits that come from a relationship with him, but for that relationship itself and the opportunity to spend an eternity with God forever.